Hello and welcome. In Germany, a long-running and often sensitive debate over conscription is getting new attention, especially because of a small detail in a new law that's caught many by surprise. Under updated military service rules, German men under 45 may now need permission from the armed forces before spending extended periods abroad. This has reignited questions about personal freedoms, preparedness, and how Germany, like many of its European neighbors, is adjusting to a more uncertain security landscape. For more on this, we are being joined by Thomas Sparrow, DW correspondent from Berlin. Thomas, always good to have you. How significant is this rule and what does it reveal about German military and security preparedness?
It is significant because it could essentially mean that millions of men would have to require permission from the armed forces if they want to have a lengthy stay abroad. Now, the German government has stressed that those approvals would be mostly automatic, that essentially they would only be rejected in times of major national crisis. And the German defense minister also stressed that the government is going to try and seek a change to that specific aspect of the law to make sure that people do not need to present those requirements, those permissions in the end. So basically the importance is more symbolic than practical. Symbolic because it has brought back memories for many Germans, painful memories for many Germans that in the past, especially during communist East Germany, had to also ask for permission to travel abroad. Symbolic as well because it basically means, or would mean if approved, that it would mean a lot of bureaucracy in a country that is already seen as being very bureaucratic. And symbolic as well because, and that's especially important for critics, this is seen as basically a compulsory conscription in waiting. Now, Germany doesn't have compulsory conscription, but critics believe that measures like this are basically there just as a compulsory conscription in waiting. So all in all, more symbolic importance than a practical symbolic importance, and one that the German government is trying to change because this has essentially garnered a lot of controversy here in the country.
And what kind of a reaction has there been to this provision in Germany and more broadly to the conscription controversy?
There have been protests in the streets, especially from young Germans who see this as I stress, as basically military conscription in waiting, that some of their freedoms are being taken away. The German government has scrambled to find an appropriate reaction to this. So there's also controversy going towards the German defense minister in particular. And what this all means for Germany is, again, a heightened debate about what exactly it means to have this voluntary conscription now. The law changed last year. Germany is now in this voluntary conscription phase where it's looking specifically to get young people, young men in particular, to join the armed forces voluntarily by, for example, offering good salaries or better salaries than in the past. But there are lots of questions as to how this exactly would happen and whether young males would actually join the army, specifically now in these difficult times. For Germany, a very sensitive issue as well, because Germany suspended compulsory conscription in 2011. And after that, Germany's armed forces went through a very difficult phase. And it was only after the war in Ukraine began that the German government decided that it was time to modernize the German armed forces and to make sure that many more people joined them voluntarily. But if not voluntarily, then there's also the possibility that a compulsory conscription would be back on the table.
Also, across Europe, many governments are strengthening their militaries. How does Germany's approach compare?
Well, absolutely. It is not something that only Germany is focusing because the war in Ukraine, the tensions in the Middle East have heightened also concerns among European leaders, among European governments about how they can be better prepared militarily in terms of also security if the war, for example, in Ukraine continues. What exactly do they need to do? So some countries like Germany are specifically focusing on this issue of voluntary conscription, but it all goes down to a certain element of concern, specifically when it comes to, for example, understanding that they cannot rely on the United States under NATO, especially under Donald Trump, that they need to look for their own defense objectives and goals on their own among European partners. It also has to do with the fact that security has increased in the region, or security concerns have increased, that the war in Ukraine does not see signs of ending anytime soon. So basically what all this shows is that Germany, but also other European countries, are looking for ways in which they could modernize their armed forces, in which they could increase their preparedness, in which they could increase their security in very difficult times for Europe and the world.
All right, Thomas, thank you so much for that report from Berlin.